Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our last class for English 221. And this is for Wednesday, the 11th. And we are talking about Othello. I had left you with watching a Harvard presentation on Othello. If nothing else, it gave you the sense of classroom interaction, which is something that we haven't necessarily had outside of our discussion forums. And obviously, you can see that the presentation identified some of the major themes, things like race, evil, love or loves, jealousy, order, chaos, honesty and falsity, self-knowledge, class, nation and place, honor, reputation, of course, which we also saw with Much Ado About Nothing, insecurity, women's rights, animal imagery, and dark light imagery. Perhaps so those might be topics that you could examine in a journal, or ultimately could be topics that you could examine in a paper. Just to remind you that your paper is going to be due on the day in which our final exam will be taking place. So paper number 2 on the histories or tragedies will be due by 8 a.m. on the 16th of May. And I will be posting our final exam at 8 a.m. on the 16th of May, and you will have 24 hours in which to complete that exam. So you'll have until the 17th. I ask that you send that as well as your paper via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. The exam is an essay exam, and you will be also asked to perhaps comment on some important quotation. And it's open book, open notes, so feel free to use resources. If we were taking this exam in class, you would spend approximately 2 hours taking the exam. So that's what I anticipate you devoting for that exam. Certainly, I don't expect you to spend 24 hours taking that exam. And the idea is not that it would be as neat or polished as anything that you would obviously do if you had a paper or even a journal due, where you'd have days, if not weeks. But basically, I just want to make sure that you can put together some of the major themes and ideas that we've been talking about over the semester. And one of the things we've talked about is the distinction between reading versus performance. And in terms of the Archangel audio, I had hoped that that would give you the opportunity to read along as you were actually listening to the text itself. Now, one of the things that was barely discussed in the Harvard presentation is what's known as marriage scene. And this is an Act 3, Scene 3. By this point, we know that the pyramid structure of a Shakespearean play would dictate that when we get to the third act, that's going to be the height of conflict or tension. And this is where Iago ultimately convinces Othello about Desdemona's infidelity. And they're both kneeling in front of one another, and some have likened it to a kind of faux wedding. In fact, in terms of trying to speculate as to what Iago's motives might be, some have even argued that there could be homoerotic tendencies and that he's fueled by jealousy, which we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. One of the things that I think that the Harvard presentation also could have discussed is some of the further subtleties associated with Raisin, or associated with racism. I always think about a play, Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, which I highly recommend. And it was written in the 1950s, and it's about an African-American family who's trying to move into an all-Caucasian neighborhood, and the pushback that occurs. One of the characters, she's quite confused as to why there's so much pushback, and she asks, what are they all afraid of, that we're going to eat them? And I think the response is very telling. No, that we're going to marry them. And obviously that's the main impetus of action, is that Othello has crossed a boundary. He's certainly good enough to be a companion, he's certainly good enough to be a soldier, he's certainly good enough to be a guest, but he's not good enough to be with the fair Desdemona because of the color of his skin. And the language is quite vulgar, as many of you indicated in some of your discussion questions. When Roderigo makes reference to the thick-lipped one, for instance, in Act 1, Scene 1, line 66. Or Iago makes reference to the old black ram tupping your white ewe, Act 1, Scene 1, line 88. Or making the beast with two backs, Act 1, Scene 1, line 116. Notice all of his prose passages, which really reflects the idea of his bestiality. And this is a very crude and bestial kind of play. Or Brambantio talking about Othello's sooty bosom, Act 1, Scene 2, line 70. One of the things that is so clever about this play is that the truth is twisted to arouse suspicion. For instance, the fact that she has deceived her father and now she may deceive thee in Act 1, Scene 3, line 292. And that is something that preys on Othello's mind, that she has indeed chosen him over her father's wishes. We know how radical of an idea that is because we've read A Midsummer Night's Dream. And what does this mean about the possibility of her not being loyal or faithful to Othello? Because ultimately the husband would be the male replacement for the father figure. Iago reinforces this in Act 3, Scene 2, line 206, saying, "She deceived your father marrying you." And of course, this is something that Brabantio had laid out earlier on. Iago has been called Shakespeare's most consummate villain. He perhaps is Shakespeare's most intelligent villain. He's a master manipulator of psychology, particularly weaknesses. He knows that Cassio's weakness is drunkenness. We've seen how Shakespeare has oftentimes talked about inebriation from a symbolic perspective. He knows that Roderigo is filled with lust, so he's able to take advantage of that. He knows that Othello is filled with insecurity because he's a soldier and he doesn't really have experience with romance, and of course because he's a Moor. So he's an outsider. And he also takes advantage of his own wife, Emilia, and her desire to please Iago by getting the handkerchief. And he's called throughout the play the honest Iago. There's some irony there. One must wonder, however, what happened in the past to allow him to earn this particular reputation of honest, because it seems that he's anything but when we watch the play. In terms of some of Iago's motivations, I had suggested that some scholars have argued that perhaps there are some homoerotic tendencies, that Iago really feels quite jealous that he's lost Othello to the Desdemona. But there also is the idea of sport and profit, which is something that we saw with Don John as well. He seemed to just enjoy evil for the sake of evil in Much Ado About Nothing. Remember that Cassio received a promotion over Iago, so there is that kind of jealousy. And we know what happens when you want position. We saw that with Macbeth. Individuals would be willing to even kill for advancement. Roderigo, in addition to his lust for Desdemona, also has money, so Iago takes this as a profit-making opportunity. Put money in thy purse. And there is a rumor, but there is no evidence to substantiate it, that Emilia had an affair with Othello. It's only mentioned briefly. Again, it's not in any way something that we can prove through evidence in the play. And again, I think it goes to show the idea of rumor and how rumor helps to propel action, because this entire play is based on rumor and hearsay, just like Much Ado About Nothing. I think women's rights are particularly interesting in this play. When Emilia talks about in Act 3, Scene 4, line 103, that men are stomachs and they merely belch us out. This is a wonderful opportunity to show the female perspective of how the males mistreat females. Desdemona talks about in Act 4, Scene 3, line 86, as you can see in the notes below, it's husbands' faults if wives do fall. And the women are treated terribly in this play. Think about how Iago treats Emilia, his own wife. Think about how Othello treats Desdemona, or even Cassio and how he treats Bianca. And we can see Emilia and Desdemona as either representations of strength because of their purity and their loyalty, but also weaknesses as well, especially Desdemona, when she dies, basically taking the guilt. They're saying that she herself is responsible. I had likened this play to a domestic violence tragedy, and certainly there is that idea of the victim taking responsibility in domestic violence. So once again, we see how Shakespeare shows both sides, both strength and weakness, in giving us a certain level of complexity with character. Probably one of the most famous elements in Othello is the handkerchief. I would argue perhaps the most famous theatrical prop that exists. Without that handkerchief, that piece of physical evidence, the entire play falls apart. And think about Othello himself and his ending speech when he talks about his rationalizations as to why he must kill Desdemona. Act 5, Scene 2, line 6. Yet she must die, else she'll betray more men. And then Othello's final speech, and then his suicide. To remember him as he was, I've done the state some service, and they know it, which we can either see as an act of nobility, but we can also see that as a very self-serving statement as well. Which gets us to our attendance question today, and this will be our last attendance question. That will be due Friday the 13th at 8 a.m. Do you think Othello can be considered a tragic hero? And why or why not? Do you think Othello can be considered a tragic hero based on the criteria we've talked about? Why and why not? So, as you know, there is one last play that I have assigned as extra credit, and it is entitled The Tempest. So if you wanted to earn a little bit of extra credit, you can hand in a journal on The Tempest, or if you so wanted to, there will also be a final examination question on The Tempest so that you could earn some extra credit points. The Tempest is part of the last genre of plays that we believe Shakespeare wrote before his retirement. These would be after the tragedies, and they're known as tragic comedies because they have very dark elements within them, much like we would expect with tragedies. But there's music and dance and a happy ending, much like we would expect with comedy. And specifically, The Tempest is thought to be Shakespeare's last play. So this would be his goodbye to his audience. And the main character, Prospero, is often seen as a kind of Shakespeare who not only controls and manipulates action, but basically in the end says goodbye to his audience. Now, I had mentioned previously about adaptations of Shakespearean plays that were done on in an HBO series entitled Shakespeare's Animated Tales. In about 25 to 30 minutes or so, they've given an animated version of the tales. They were meant for younger audiences, but I think all audiences can understand them. And I wanted to leave you with that last performance since ultimately I have been talking about different kinds of performances of the plays. You're not required to watch this animated version of The Tempest. Again, it's approximately a half hour long or so, and obviously it's going to be quite condensed, but it'll give you a general background of The Tempest, which happens to be about a great storm, both literally and figuratively, with Prospero, a magician who basically has been shipwrecked and exiled on an island, and how he uses the magical creatures there, Ariel and Caliban, for his own purposes. It just so happens that all of the people who have betrayed him previously in his kingdom and which resulted in his shipwreck are all traveling in a boat for a wedding, or a ship, I should say, and they are passing by the island that he's been shipwrecked on with his daughter, Miranda, so that he creates some magical spells for Tempest so that all of these individuals are shipwrecked and on various parts of the island, and then he can enact his revenge. That's the darker part of the play, but in the end he shows mercy. And the play oftentimes is read as a commentary on colonialism, the idea of the native European that comes to a particular land and takes advantage of the native indigenous population as represented by Caliban and also represented by Ariel, who is a light and fairy spirit, but Caliban is the deformed monstrosity of a witch who was on the island. And Caliban is one of the more interesting characters in the play because despite the fact that he's supposed to be monstrous, he has some of the most beautiful language in the play. And he says quite tellingly that, the result of having Prosper on the island is that he taught Caliban language and how to curse. And again, you can think about some parallels with native indigenous population as they were colonized by European. So note all of Caliban's beautiful poetry. But that said, if you wanted to watch a condensed version of The Tempest, I recommend Shakespeare's Animated Tales. But of course, you know that there are many versions of Shakespeare, whether it be the Globe or Shakespeare in the Park, or whether it be the BBC version, or whether it be the Royal Shakespeare Company, or whether it be Archangel Audio. So you've got lots of options. And you'll see that at the very ending of the notes, I have a farewell to you from Biscotti Cappuccino the Pug, who happens to be the president of Pug University. So I hope you're able to click on that. It's approximately a minute or so. And again, the attendance question is for Friday the 13th at 8 a.m. Do you think Othello should be considered a tragic hero? Why or why not? So for one last time before the final, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Thank you for being part of this very unusual semester amongst a couple of years of very unusual semesters, but we're still standing. So congratulations. Take care. Bye-bye.